Dear class, welcome back to American National Government. Last time we talked about federalism and looked at the early phase of federalism, dual federalism. This time we'll look at the New Deal, essentially a new era in federalism and a major change in the way we think about welfare. So we saw industrialization, we saw the era of slavery before that, and we saw the super exploitation of labor. We saw the indentured servitude era as well, in the North. And we also looked at child labor during this entire time in the US prior to the early 1900s. And we see that the government essentially supports capitalists in this time. During the era of industrialization, we saw that government supports capitalists with business deals, and the capitalists then pay back some of that favor by financing elections, right? A complete system of corruption has been set up. We also saw that there were too many monopolies in the industrial section, right? We had the production of steel being managed by Carnegie. There's very few companies who are in, mining the coal and the iron. And you also have monopolies when it comes to producing the railroads and producing the bridges, even providing steel for buildings, right? So you see entire monopolies being set up. These kinds of monopolies were becoming common during the 1800s, the late 1800s. The emergence of a few families or people with immense wealth and control over business. And we saw that technically this is not a free market, because a free market means no government intervention in the industry, right? So in this case, the government intervened. There was very little regulation, but it essentially supported the market actors, right? The producers, basically. So it's not that the government was not involved. It played a different kind of role. It protected the markets. And we looked previously at what these kinds of the kinds of theories that explain this kind of behavior, right? We looked at Marx and Engels, we looked at Adam Smith's ideas, and we looked at John Locke. John Locke is proposing that the government be set up to protect private property. So we see that until this 1880s, the US federal government has not posed a threat to any of the shenanigans that have happened. In fact, they have protected it, right? Now we're going to see that US Congress is pushing back. So Congress passes a few acts to redefine how they understand welfare, essentially, right? So they pass laws with the help of the presidents. So the bills are proposed either in the Senate or the House of Representatives in Congress. And once they pass both houses, they go to the president for approval. And when the president approves, it becomes a congressional act. 1887, they pass the Interstate Commerce Act. 1890, they pass the Sherman Antitrust Act. 1930s, they propose and pass the Unemployment Act. So these are huge achievements. And because they redefine who is covered under welfare, right? Before it was just the welfare of the rich and the political elites. Now we see that it's welfare for the whole country, welfare in the general interest of people living in the US. So, of course, the courts immediately challenged these acts of Congress because these are the federal government intervening in a huge way at a national level on issues that are supposed to be addressed by states. Of course, interstate commerce, interstate activities are not addressed by states. But what's happening inside the state, for example, you have factory activity happening, industry development. I mean, states are trying really hard to attract business and keep it, right? They want people to live in their state so they can have taxes, right? And so they are trying to win over the business people, and they don't want to scare them away with regulation. However, certain things happen. We see the level of concentration of economic power and political influence of these trust people who are in charge of these trusts and monopolies. And so this is adversely affecting workers. It's providing no protection for children. And basically, the US is in a position where it hasn't provided any services for people, right? And so now the federal government is saying, you know what, we've sat behind these chairs, we've stayed away from what the states are doing, but we can no longer look away because certain things are happening which are very dangerous and bad for our country. So a major issue, a major threat also is posed by World War I. In 1914, 1918, World War I happened, right? And the war had disrupted a period of economic growth and international trade, especially between the US and Europe. With these linkages broken, the US was in a tough spot. And this war type activities are also happening in Asia. And so basically the trading partners with the US are getting hammered at this time. They're in a bad place. Europe essentially gets destroyed and it has to rebuild itself from scratch. So all of these economic trade problems cause problems for US economy because the US producers cannot export, and exports are the main source of income at this time. So the economy slowly goes into a recession, and ultimately in 1929, we have the stock market crash. And a decade of economic depression begins. So the stock market crash was really bad, and we'll go into that. At this time, Western scholars and governments were scrambling to find a solution. How are we going to address this? What are we going to do? I mean, right now we have the reserve powers which prohibit the federal government from intervening. And we've seen that the courts are fighting back. So it's not going to be easy. At the same time, the fact that these acts passed means that there's considerable support in the population for reform. And Congress, the representatives are realizing this, that if they don't do anything, they're not going to get reelected again. They're not doing anything to help the workers. And as we talked about before, workers are very organized in the 1800s around Europe, even in the US, and they are writing about these issues. They're talking to each other, they're organizing, and they are voting. So there's a lot of fear around this time that if we don't do anything meaningful, then we will not be able to hold office, right? And so Congress has to be responsible. And so at this time, John Maynard Keynes, who is an economist, came up with an idea. He says, let the federal government inject money into the economy by buying goods and services to avoid recession, to basically reverse the recession and high level of unemployment. So basically, this is a life-saving moment because they realize this might work. If the government starts buying services from businesses, the businesses can now hire people again, and those people can have money again in their pockets. They can go and spend it, and spending it on businesses and food and housing and other things will then lift up the economy, right? And it did that work. It was a very successful idea. And all the economies in the West start to adopt it immediately because they realize this is a good idea. And not only that, all economies in the world today, all countries, adopt this policy. To a certain level, the government injects money into the economy by buying goods and services to avoid recessions and unemployment. And so the scholars that follow this line of thinking are called Keynesians. And the type of economics that comes out of this is called Keynesian economics. Again, how are we going to pay for this? Where is that billion, billions, $20 billion actually, over $20 billion was spent by FDR to do something like this. How did they get the money to do that, right? So they realized they could raise tax rates, they could print money, just like, monopoly money, or they could issue bonds. That means they could issue federal debt, right? And then people would buy that and give them the money, and then they would then give that money to the businesses, and then the Keynesian process would begin. So the federal government was, by this time, by the 1800s, it had started issuing debt. So it paid for all the 1776 expenses. Basically, they received money from France, from Holland, right, or Netherlands. These people gave money to the US to fight the British. And so all that debt had to be paid off, and the US did that by issuing debt, and the public bought that debt, and then the government engaged in some kind of activity, for example, raising taxes. The federal government raised taxes and was able to use some of those taxes to pay off the debt. So the government did the same thing here. So now you're seeing a major shift in the way that government is functioning. The federal government decides it's going to just give some money to the state governments to help revive the national economy. It's just becoming this huge, uh, you know, parental kind of figure. It's just giving money to the 50 states and saying, keep it. You're going to need it to fix your state, right? The economic system is falling apart. You need money. Keep this money. And you're going through a major reinterpretation of social values at this time. I mean, people feel the need for major change, right? They don't want to work in these horrible work conditions anymore. They don't want to work 364 days a week and, inhale bad kind of smoke, and then get sick all the time. They don't want their kids to be sick and, dying in some factories, working and becoming sick in the mines. People are sick and tired of that. They really want the government to do something. And so here we are going through a real change in the way government sees itself and its role. For the first time, it's providing public services. I mean, this is unthinkable, right? They provide defense, but they never have provide sort of this public infrastructure before, right? There's no public schools, there's no healthcare and medicine for free. Only the rich can afford these things. Poor people are just getting sick and dying, right? And so for the first time, they start to reevaluate the role of government in society. And let's look again. So the Great Depression, World War I, all of that is causing the major reset. What was the Great Depression like, in fact? So in the 1930s, you saw the unemployment rate was about 25 to 30%, meaning that the working age population, about 1/3 to 1/4 of them were unemployed. So if you think about it, a lot of the women, one might ask and say, well, half the population or labor force would be women, and they would already be unemployed, right? Because we think that women were staying at home. But actually, in this time, women were working. They were poor. And so everybody had to work somewhere, right? Even the kids were working. So to have this unemployment rate was devastating for poor people because everybody is supposed to be working. They don't make enough, right? So this time was a terrible time. You had job loss, business loss, bank failures, saving loss. Savings were disappearing with the stock market crash and other kinds of problems. The banks were failing because they were heavily invested in the stock market, and suddenly they have nothing. All the money's gone. And so they've basically lost your savings. And now people are being laid off during this time because the demand for goods has reduced. And so producers are looking at the workers and saying, we want to keep you on, but we can't because there's no demand right now, right? Nobody's buying our stuff. And so businesses are folding as well. And there was no way out of the situation. So here are some videos I want you to look at. Before this also, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president who ushered in this new age of cooperation in federalism with the New Deal, right? So this era is called the era of cooperation in federalism. After this point, the government will always try to protect the economy by spending. So it will, whenever it sees that there is a general reduction in the demand for goods, the government will step in and spend money to fill in the gaps and make sure that the economy is stable and growing. So in 1937, the New Deal finally passes. Congress expands its welfare clause, and we'll look more about this when we talk about the presidency. Watch some videos about the Great Depression. So the first one is called The Great Depression, and it's produced by this group called the Plain Bagel. It's a very interesting name. Let's go to the video for a second.
In the world of finance, we're often quick to forget the tragedies of the past, yet valuable lessons are to be had by exploring their causes and effects. After all, in a world of ever-changing rules, products, and services, history is the one constant that can guide us through the ambiguity.
So I don't really want to watch this here with you. I want you to watch the video. It's linked to your syllabus. So these give you some background about the history of the Great Depression, and there's more stuff. The next two videos focus on FDR's first 100 days in office and also the Great Depression. These are produced by PBS, and so you can go ahead and watch those. So think about what you watched, okay? Think about what solutions were suggested by FDR in the New Deal. And did the programs work? This is something definitely to think about. Let's stop here for this video, and next time we'll talk a little bit more about other things.